Before sunrise in Ouagadougou, a warning siren cuts through the quiet. A father rises, checks the door, then looks back at his child, still asleep. In the Sahel, security is not a talking point. It is a nightly calculation about whether a family will make it to morning. While ordinary people measure safety in heartbeats, power is being rearranged above them. In 2024, when Russia signed agreements to help build arms manufacturing facilities inside Niger, Paris went quiet. Silence does not mean approval. It means recognition. For the first time in decades, a Sahelian state could produce its own ammunition and maintain its own equipment without waiting for foreign permissions. That single shift changes the balance of access, and access has defined control here for 60 years. The question that matters now is not whether this is bold, but whether it is the only path left. This moment did not arrive by accident. After years of foreign bases, counter-terror missions, and aid packages that promised stability but delivered cycles of violence, 3 governments chose a clean break. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose in 2022 after massacres in the north exposed a system that could not protect its own soldiers or civilians. In Mali and Niger, similar frustrations hardened into decisions that severed ties outright. No gradual transition, no quiet handover, a full strategic reset. Critics call it reckless, supporters call it overdue. For families living between insurgent checkpoints, the labels matter less than results. Russia's entry is not framed as ideology, but as capacity. Weapons training, maintenance, and production on African soil promise speed and autonomy, where approvals once took months. For Western capitals, that promise challenges a post-colonial security order built on conditional access. For Sahelian leaders, it offers survival without lectures. Yet autonomy without accountability carries risks, and effectiveness measured only by battlefield gains can blur the line between protection and harm. Here is the first question to carry forward. If security is the foundation of family, faith, and social order, who should control the tools that provide it? And when a nation chooses control for itself, who bears the cost if the gamble fails? The answer will not come from speeches. It will come from what happens on the ground next. Do you believe real sovereignty can coexist with lasting security, or does one inevitably consume the other? The break did not happen in private conference rooms or behind diplomatic language. It happened in public, fast, and without apology. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger did not request a drawdown of Western forces. They forced them out. Years of foreign military presence, billions in aid, and constant intelligence coordination ended with a single message. The old security arrangement was over. For decades, Western partnerships had promised stability through counterterrorism operations and training missions. On paper, the architecture looked comprehensive. On the ground, villages kept emptying, soldiers kept dying, and families kept burying the young. A Malian farmer in the center of the country described it simply to local radio. The uniforms changed, the checkpoints stayed, and the fear never left. That experience, repeated across borders, hardened into a decision that security would no longer be outsourced. The logic behind the break was brutally pragmatic. As long as access to weapons, spare parts, and maintenance depended on foreign approvals, Sahelian armies could not act independently. Equipment arrived late, often outdated, and always tied to political conditions that had little to do with immediate survival. Western officials spoke of human rights certifications and reform benchmarks. Commanders in the field counted ammunition and waited. When attacks surged and responses stalled, confidence collapsed. That is the gap Russia moved to fill. Moscow did not arrive with speeches about governance. It arrived with contracts, training programs, rapid delivery of equipment, and the most consequential promise of all, production capacity on African soil. The 2024 agreements with Niger to build arms manufacturing facilities marked the turning point. This was not a sale of rifles or a temporary deployment of advisors. It was a transfer of industrial capability, ammunition lines, repair facilities for armored vehicles, and a supply chain that reduced dependence on foreign airlifts. For the first time in a generation, a Sahelian state could plan military operations without calculating whether a foreign capital would approve the next shipment. To leaders who had watched their authority constrained by access for years, this felt like sovereignty made tangible. To Western capitals, it looked like a direct challenge to a system designed to keep control centralized. The decision was not without alternatives, and the governments involved pursued them simultaneously. Turkey supplied drones without lengthy political conditions, altering surveillance and strike capabilities in contested zones. China expanded infrastructure deals, focusing on roads, power, and logistics that supported state presence outside capital cities. These relationships were transactional and fast. They did not promise peace. They promised tools. For populations living with daily insecurity, tools mattered more than rhetoric. A shopkeeper in Ouagadougou summed it up when asked about the shift. If the state can protect the road, business returns. If it cannot, nothing else matters. Western responses followed a familiar pattern. Sanctions were imposed. Aid was frozen. Warnings about instability and isolation filled press briefings. Officials stressed the risks of working with Russian military contractors, pointing to mixed results and allegations of civilian harm. Those concerns were not invented. Operations conducted under looser rules of engagement produced tactical gains alongside serious costs. But to the juntas in power, effectiveness was measured by survival and control, not international approval. They argued that the previous system optimized for appearances while violence spread. In their calculus, rejecting that system was not a gamble. It was an admission that the gamble had already failed. The real shift, however, was psychological. When Western forces left and new partnerships arrived, crowds celebrated in the streets. The scenes were not about Moscow. They were about departure. Anti-French sentiment, fueled by decades of unmet promises and perceived exploitation, translated into public backing for the break. That support mattered. It provided legitimacy untethered from elections and complicated any external attempt to portray the new governments as isolated or fragile. Popular backing does not guarantee success, but it changes the cost of reversal. This is the hinge of the story. By choosing capacity over conditionality, Sahelian leaders rewrote the terms of security. They gained autonomy, not peace. They gained speed, not certainty. And they accepted new dependencies even as they shed old ones. The immediate question is not whether Russia's model is benevolent. It is whether this shift produces enough security to justify its risks. Because if the violence recedes even marginally, the argument for the old order weakens everywhere. But if it worsens, the warning will echo just as loudly. The next chapter will be written not in statements, but in whether families sleep through the night. And that outcome will decide whether this break becomes a blueprint or a cautionary tale. The turning point did not arrive with a single announcement. It arrived as a sequence of decisions that together made retreat impossible. When Ibrahim Traoré confirmed the expulsion of French forces from Burkina Faso, the message was unmistakable. This was not leverage for renegotiation. It was a line drawn. In the days that followed, streets filled with people waving flags, singing, and celebrating the departure of a presence that had defined their security landscape for generations. For many outside observers, the images were unsettling. For those on the ground, they were cathartic. Celebration was not about Russia or any new partner. It was about the end of dependence. The reaction inside Sahelian capitals revealed the emotional core of the shift. Soldiers who had spent years coordinating with foreign commands now answered only to their own leadership. Officers described a renewed sense of purpose, even as they acknowledged the risks ahead. A young lieutenant in northern Burkina Faso spoke to local media about the change in tone. Orders were faster. Decisions were closer to the battlefield. There was no waiting for approval from distant desks. That immediacy, he said, felt like dignity restored. But dignity does not stop bullets, and the real test came quickly. Operations intensified. Russian-linked contractors embedded with local forces expanded counterinsurgency campaigns that Western militaries had avoided under strict rules of engagement. In some areas, attacks were pushed back. In others, violence surged, and civilian casualties mounted. Human rights groups raised alarms. Western governments amplified those warnings, framing the new approach as reckless and destabilizing. Press conferences in Paris and Washington stressed that abandoning established partnerships would lead to chaos. The language was urgent, almost pleading, but it landed on audiences that felt they had already lived through chaos under the old system. Public opinion inside the Sahel hardened. Anti-French sentiment, long simmering, crystallized into a shared narrative of betrayal and exploitation. Decades of military cooperation had not prevented massacres or secured rural roads. Uranium and gold left the ground, but schools and clinics remained scarce. In that context, warnings from former partners rang hollow. When crowds gathered to support the new governments, it was not because they trusted every decision being made. It was because they trusted the alternative even less. That popular backing became a shield, insulating leaders from immediate external pressure and complicating any effort to reverse course. International reactions were sharper behind closed doors. European officials worried openly about precedent. If three of the poorest and most fragile states could reject Western security oversight and survive, others might follow. African governments elsewhere began reassessing their own arrangements. Requests to close or renegotiate foreign bases surfaced. Regional blocs debated the implications of a Sahel operating outside traditional frameworks. The shift was no longer theoretical. It was observable, and it forced a recalculation far beyond the region. For the United States, the moment carried a different weight. Years of intelligence infrastructure and counter-terror coordination were suddenly constrained. American officials emphasized concerns about extremist groups exploiting the transition. At the same time, they recognized a deeper challenge. Influence built on conditional access was losing its leverage. The question was no longer how to manage Sahelian partners, but whether partnership itself needed redefinition. Public statements remained cautious, but the undertone was unmistakable. Control was slipping. The climax of this phase lies in the contradiction at its center. The new security approach promised effectiveness without permission, but it also normalized methods that alarmed the international community. Success was measured by territory held and attacks prevented, not by approval ratings abroad. That recalibration of values marked a clean break from the past. It also raised a stark moral question. Can security achieved through harder tactics create lasting stability, or does it sow the seeds of future violence? Within Burkina Faso, families watched the developments with a mixture of hope and dread. A mother in a town near the northern front described the dilemma plainly. She wanted the soldiers to win. She also wanted her children safe from both insurgents and those sent to fight them. That tension captures the heart of the moment. The celebration of sovereignty coexisted with fear of what sovereignty would demand. This is where the story reaches its emotional peak. The Sahelian governments have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed without humiliation or force. Their people have publicly endorsed that crossing, not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because the old promises had lost credibility. The world is now watching a live experiment in security autonomy. If violence declines, even slightly, the argument for the previous order weakens everywhere. If it rises, the costs will be paid first by those who cheered the loudest. The next question hangs unresolved. When effectiveness becomes the primary measure, who decides where the line is drawn? And if that line is crossed, will the people who demanded sovereignty accept the price that comes with it? As the security architecture shifted, the consequences moved quickly from military briefings into ordinary life. In Burkina Faso, markets reopened along some routes once considered too dangerous to travel. In other areas, displacement continued as families fled, renewed clashes sparked by intensified operations. The promise of autonomy delivered uneven results, and that unevenness became the defining feature of daily life. For civilians, progress was not measured by strategic maps, but by whether children could walk to school, and farmers could reach their fields without escort. The new approach raised expectations, and expectations once raised are unforgiving. Politically, power consolidated fast. Emergency measures justified by security threats expanded executive authority. Decision-making narrowed to small circles of military leaders who argued that unity was essential in a fight for survival. Supporters accepted this logic, pointing to decades of civilian governments that had relied on foreign backing and failed to stop the violence. Critics warned that postponing accountability risked hardening authoritarian rule. Both views coexisted in the same households. Stability became the currency that justified delay. The question was how long delay could last before it became permanent. Economic effects followed a similar pattern. The expulsion of Western forces and the freezing of aid disrupted local economies tied to foreign bases. Jobs vanished overnight. At the same time, new partnerships redirected spending toward domestic logistics, repairs, and infrastructure linked to security. In Niger, debates intensified around uranium revenues and who would benefit as traditional arrangements with French companies were challenged. For many citizens, the issue was not ideology, but fairness. Resources had left for decades with little visible return. Any new model would be judged by whether it changed that reality. The social fabric absorbed the strain. Families split as young men joined security forces or fled violence. Urban neighborhoods saw an influx of displaced rural populations, stretching services already under pressure. Religious leaders and community elders stepped into mediation roles, urging restraint and cohesion. Their messages resonated with older generations who remembered earlier cycles of upheaval. They framed the moment not as a revolution, but as a test of character. Security without moral limits, they cautioned, risks eroding the very society it claims to protect. Regionally, the consequences extended beyond borders. The emerging alliance between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger created a shared security zone that altered political calculations. An attack in one state increasingly drew responses from the others. That collective posture reduced isolation, but raised the stakes of any confrontation. Neighboring governments watched closely, weighing the benefits of solidarity against the risk of entanglement. The Sahel was no longer a set of isolated crises. It was becoming a single theater with shared outcomes. From the perspective of United States and France, these developments carried long-term implications. Decades of influence built through training missions, aid programs, and intelligence partnerships were being replaced by uncertainty. Officials emphasized concerns about human rights and regional spillover, but beneath those statements lay a deeper anxiety. If security cooperation could be rejected so decisively, the leverage that sustained Western engagement across Africa weakened. The Sahel was testing whether alternative arrangements could endure under pressure. For civilians, the geopolitical debate felt distant compared to immediate trade-offs. A shop owner in a border town described the dilemma with clarity. Business improved when patrols increased, but fear returned when operations intensified and rumors of retaliation spread. Security brought opportunity and risk in equal measure. The state's promise was protection. Its challenge was restraint. Balancing the two would determine whether public support held. This phase of the story is defined by tension rather than resolution. Autonomy created space for action, but it also concentrated responsibility. There was no longer a foreign partner to blame when strategies failed. Every success and every mistake belonged to the same leadership that had demanded control. That ownership sharpened accountability in theory, even as formal checks were postponed in practice. The consequences now unfolding will shape politics for a generation. If stability improves, leaders will claim vindication and expand the model. If violence escalates, the social costs will undermine the legitimacy that popular celebrations once provided. The Sahel has entered a period where choices carry immediate weight. Security is no longer outsourced, it is owned. And ownership means that the next outcomes, good or bad, will define not just policy, but the social contract itself. The unresolved question remains: can a society emerging from constant threat build stability without sacrificing the principles that hold families together? Or will the pursuit of security, unchecked by accountability, create new fractures that no alliance can contain? From Washington, the shift in the Sahel is viewed less as a regional anomaly and more as a strategic warning. For decades, American engagement in West Africa followed a familiar logic: provide intelligence, training, and counter-terror support, while ensuring local militaries never became strong enough to act entirely on their own. That balance was meant to contain extremist threats without creating new power centers. What is happening now in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger disrupts that formula. When security partnerships are rejected outright, influence built on access begins to evaporate. U.S. officials have publicly framed the Sahel's pivot toward Russia as destabilizing, warning of increased terrorism, civilian harm, and authoritarian consolidation. Those concerns are not theoretical. Transitions of this scale create gaps, and gaps are where violent actors thrive. At the same time, American policymakers understand that the old model was losing credibility on the ground. Years of counter-terror operations did not prevent the spread of insurgent groups or protect rural populations. In that context, lectures about reform carried limited weight. The challenge for Washington is not simply countering Moscow's presence, it is answering a harder question. What does partnership mean when conditions are no longer accepted? For France, the stakes feel more immediate. The loss of military access is paired with economic anxiety. Uranium from Niger and other resource arrangements across the Sahel supported French energy security and industrial capacity for generations. As those links are severed abruptly rather than renegotiated, Paris faces a reality it has long postponed. Control cannot be assumed when former colonies decide to walk away together. That loss of certainty explains the urgency in European rhetoric and the focus on preventing a wider domino effect. Globally, other powers are watching closely. Some see opportunity, others see risk. If the Sahel manages even partial stabilization outside Western oversight, it signals that alternative security arrangements are viable. That possibility alone reshapes calculations from North Africa to Central Africa. Several governments have already begun reassessing foreign base agreements and long-standing defense partnerships. The question is no longer whether the post-colonial security order can be challenged. It is whether it can survive intact. For American audiences concerned with national security, this matters beyond Africa. Instability in the Sahel affects migration flows, transnational extremism, and access to strategic resources. A breakdown or a confrontation involving major powers would not remain contained. That is why U.S. responses balance caution with pressure, signaling concern without triggering escalation. But restraint has limits. If Western losses in influence are perceived as existential, the temptation to reverse the trend grows. This is the moment of global tension. The Sahel's leaders are betting that unity and new partnerships will deter interference. Washington and its allies are weighing how much change they can tolerate without risking broader instability. Between those calculations lies a narrow path where sovereignty and security might coexist. The next steps will determine whether this shift becomes a regional adjustment or the opening chapter of a far more dangerous reckoning. What is unfolding in the Sahel is larger than any single leader or alliance. It is a test of whether a region, long defined by external control, can redefine security on its own terms without tearing itself apart. Ibrahim Traoré and his counterparts have framed their decisions as acts of necessity, not ambition. In their view, dependence had failed, and survival demanded a break. That argument resonates with populations exhausted by years of violence and broken promises. But necessity does not erase consequences, and the coming months will determine which costs are paid and by whom. The most immediate danger is escalation beyond control. If violence spreads or civilian harm deepens, public support could fracture. Unity built on anger at the past is fragile when daily life does not improve. At the same time, external pressure is unlikely to fade quietly. Economic leverage, diplomatic isolation, and covert efforts to weaken the alliance remain real possibilities. The Sahel's leaders are betting that solidarity and new partnerships will deter such moves. History suggests deterrence works only when outcomes remain uncertain for all sides. There is also a quieter risk, one that unfolds without headlines. Security achieved through concentrated power can harden into permanent rule. Emergency measures justified today can become habits tomorrow. Older generations understand this pattern. They have seen moments when fear traded accountability for order, only to discover later that order without limits erodes trust, faith, and family life. The question is not whether strong authority is sometimes necessary. It is how long a society can sustain it without losing what it seeks to protect. Looking ahead, one scenario looms large. If the Sahelian alliance can reduce attacks even modestly while keeping communities intact, it becomes proof that autonomy is possible. Other African states will follow, and the post-colonial security order will weaken in practice, not rhetoric. If, however, instability worsens or dependency simply shifts from one patron to another, the experiment will be cited as a warning for decades. Either outcome reshapes how power is understood across the continent. For those watching from abroad, especially in the United States, this is not a distant story. It touches questions of national security, moral responsibility, and the limits of influence. Stability built on consent lasts longer than stability enforced from afar, but consent must be earned through results. As this chapter closes, one question remains open. Can real sovereignty coexist with lasting security, or does the pursuit of one inevitably consume the other? If this story has made you pause, reflect on the families whose lives are shaped by decisions far above them. Consider what justice and protection mean when the stakes are survival itself. And as the Sahel moves forward, remember that history often turns not on grand strategies, but on whether ordinary people can sleep through the night in peace.